While all sorts of fantasy settings and stories are greatly different, there are facets which they all share. One of the big ones is travel. Travel is incredibly important, not just in the real world, but in fantasy as well. In fact, The Lord of the Rings, one of the foundational texts of modern fantasy storytelling, is 6 books about some guys walking. Travel is also important in each of the mainline Elder Scrolls games for different reasons, and it is portrayed differently in each of those games as well. Let's talk about travel in these games and fantasy storytelling generally, and the narrative function it has, as well as the broader implications on world building. To begin our discussion about travel in these games, I'm going to start with the game that I think does travel the best, Morrowind. Friend of the channel Takarius did a video about traveling in Morrowind. Their examination was from a mechanical and gameplay perspective, whereas this one is about narrative and world building. Go watch that video though, it is absolutely worth your time. Morrowind takes place on the island of Vardenfell, part of the province of Morrowind. Travel is incredibly important in Morrowind and especially so on Vardenfell. The province in question is ruled by the Tribunal Temple, and one of the things that is incredibly important to the temple is pilgrimage. There are a large number of times in which pilgrims are mentioned in dialogue in the game, and several quests that involve pilgrims or require that you go on a pilgrimage yourself. Of course, pilgrims are defined by travel. A pilgrimage is primarily traveling to a holy site. We can see this need for travel in the world design of Morrowind. Vardenfell has a robust transportation network, and it doesn't seem like it is too difficult for common people to access. The prices for this transportation seem to be fairly low, and there are enough people offering these transportation services that anyone is likely to be able to get from anywhere they are to anywhere they're going. The first form of transportation that you are likely to use is that of the Silt Strider Caravaneers. The Silt Strider is a large insectile creature, and its long legs are able to move through the difficult terrain of Vardenfell rather easily. There are Silt Strider platforms in all but the smallest of settlements on the island. One notable exception is that of Caldera. Caldera is a relatively young town despite its size, but is also an imperial colony. This is evidenced by its imperial architecture, which is uncommon on Vardenfell. Caldera doesn't have access to a Siltstrider platform. I'm not exactly sure as to why this is the case, but I might have a few more words to say on this a little bit later. The second form of transportation is a much less fantastical one, boats. There are a lot of islands near Vardenfell, and Vardenfell itself is, of course, an island. As such, boats are a natural and incredibly useful form of transportation for the people to use. While boats are significantly less useful for getting to locales inland, as there are few large rivers on the island, there are plenty of settlements on the coasts of Vardenfell. One minor concern that I have about the boats in the narrative of the game is this. Vardenfell is currently under a quarantine. No travel to or from the island is currently permitted under Imperial law. This would necessitate a number of vessels of the Imperial Navy to be present to ensure that this quarantine is being enforced. We never see any of these vessels, and that's fine, we don't have cause to go far out into the sea. The problem here is that travel by boat is so commonplace, even during this quarantine. I suppose the explanation must be that these boats are staying close enough to the shores of Vardenfell so as not to be suspect in the eyes of any Imperial ships that are nearby. We can only assume that the captains of these vessels make sure that they are known by the officials at each port they visit, so that suspicion of smuggling isn't brought upon them. These are assumptions, however, and nothing of the sort is stated in the game to my knowledge. The last major form of transportation in Vardenfell is the Travelers League, though Morrowind calls them the Guild Guides, of the Mages Guild. These members of the Mages Guild are capable of teleporting you to any of the other Mages Guild buildings on Vardenfell. Presumably, some of them could transport you to different Mages Guild chapters, but are not offering that service due to the quarantine mentioned earlier. This is the one I have a real problem with. Teleportation is the fastest and safest method of travel of these three. It is also the cheapest. This should not be. The price of travel with the guild guides is simply lower than the other forms of travel, and because the mages guilds are usually in the major cities, they're likely your final destinations, whereas traveling by boat or siltstrider might involve multiple layovers, depending on where you're coming from or going to. In my opinion, this is the single biggest failure of Morrowind's travel from a world building perspective. I think that teleportation should probably be close to 10 times the cost of what it is normally, and that still might be cheaper than a particularly long journey by boat. We can break this down into a two-pronged problem. The first prong, teleportation magic is really easy and is therefore very cheap. If this is the case, then why have silt striders or boats at all? Why doesn't everyone just teleport all over the place? The second prong, teleportation magic is difficult and therefore rare. If this is the case, why does the Mages Guild provide the service for such low prices? Wouldn't they charge more than the alternatives because it's faster than those alternatives? Or at the very least price match? I suppose it could be the case that there's some sort of imperial law that governs the cost of teleportation at the Mages Guild, but that seems unlikely. That would really anger the Mages Guild, as it would cut into their revenue severely, and would certainly get litigated out of existence over the years. Additionally, even if it stayed in place, it would almost certainly be phrased to allow price matching with other transportation services rather than a fixed price. In fact, the price of the service is variable in Morrowind, so a law fixing the price doesn't even solve the problem. You can construct an answer to these questions and solve this dilemma. However, I have failed to do so in any way that doesn't involve an incredibly tangled web of leaps of inference or make the Mages Guild or the world building seem totally nonsensical. If you can construct a solution to this problem, please do so in the comments below. I do want to offer the disclaimer that because in game time is not a huge concern in Morrowind, if the price of teleportation were higher, it would probably be detrimental to gameplay. That's a conceit of game design, I suppose. But let's get back to the importance of travel in the setting. Like I said, pilgrimage is an incredibly important thing on Vardenfell. In fact, Molag Mar is an entire stronghold that exists for the express purpose of being a place for pilgrims to rest and recuperate while visiting the nearby mountains, Mount Cand and Mount Asarnabibi. The geography of Vardenfell also affects travel. The landscape is dominated by a red mountain in the center of the island, creating a massive natural, and in the case of this particular mountain and its blight, supernatural, barrier to transit. The landscape is riddled with what the natives call foyadas, volcanic ravines created by the lava flow from the aforementioned mountain. The foyadas create natural barriers in some ways, but also natural pathways. The sides of the foyadas are sometimes impassably steep, but the inside is relatively flat and smooth, thus they make for good roads. Furthermore, traveling on Vardenfell is dangerous. There are all sorts of animals, many of whom carry diseases, bandits, and, demons just wandering the countryside that could happen upon a traveler. This danger is part of why Molag Mar being a stronghold is important, beyond just being a little outpost. Beyond being important in the setting, travel is important for the narrative of the game's story as well. Firstly, your character is a foreigner and is stepping into a foreign land for the first time. The alien landscape of Vardenfell is and perhaps the main character in the game's story. Beyond that, however, is the nature of the main quest. The first leg of the main quest involves you taking orders from Caius Casades, Spymaster of the Blades, the Empire's secret police service. Doing these quests will require you to travel to a number of different places. Of note, Vivec in the south of the map, Nar Mok in the west, the Ursulaku Ashlander camp in the north, and Devaith Fear's tower in the east. Importantly, you aren't just going to these places for fun. There are specific reasons that are of importance to the story as to why you are going to these places. You are going to Devaith Fear's tower, for example, because you need to talk to him specifically. Devaith Fear is one of the smartest dudes on the planet, and you have reason to suspect that he'll actually talk to you, and maybe even help you, at that juncture of the main quest. After this leg of the main quest, however, the need for travel isn't over. Now you need to go to each of the 3 great houses on Vardenfell to be named Hortator, and each of the 4 Ashlander camps to be recognized as Nerevarine. These 2 titles are necessary in order to garner the support from enough people to complete the main quest. This, of course, requires more travel. The Ursulaku camp is the hardest one to get to, though you've already gone there at this point in the quest. The other 3 are still rather remote, however. Finally, after you've done all that, there's yet more travel to be done. To finish the main quest, you need to go to Red Mountain and scour 4 strongholds of the 6th house to find a couple of important items. Once that's done, you must go into the depths of Red Mountain and defeat the Shermat Dagoth-Ur once and for all. These items are necessary to defeat Dagoth-Ur and to complete the main quest, and they were split up and hidden by Dagoth-Ur for that reason. This necessitates the search for them, which necessitates the travel to those strongholds. When you consider the narrative importance of travel in Morrowind and the presentation of it to the player through gameplay, I posit that you get an incredibly vivid view of the province. With the exception of the guild guides offering teleportation for too low a price, the travel feels very real. It feels in depth and well thought out. And given the main character that is the land of Vardenfell itself, it feels important and impactful. As I said, I think that Morrowind does this the best of the mainline Elder Scrolls games, but I do think that Skyrim is a close second, so let's talk about travel in Skyrim next. This won't take as long, don't worry. Skyrim is a very rural province, and travel in the game Skyrim reflects that. Most people don't travel from place to place beyond a few exceptions. Traveling in Skyrim tends to be a somewhat difficult affair. It is rife with danger, and there are few safe places between villages. The primary form of transport in Skyrim is by road. There are a number of Khajiit traveling merchants that roam from city to city, and they follow those roads. Furthermore, at the five larger hold capitals, there are cart services for hire that can take passengers to any of the other hold capitals. Traveling to one of the larger hold capitals costs 20 gold, though traveling to the smaller hold capitals costs 50 gold. These prices are not unreasonable for anyone but the poorest citizen, though realistically that is most of them, but they are one-way trips. People are seen traveling along the roads in Skyrim, and bandits are seen preying upon them. Most of the interesting things that happen in Skyrim happen while you are going from place to place, rather than anything interesting ever happening when you actually get to your destination. Maybe that latter part is my bias as a certified Skyrim disliker speaking, though. The main quest of Skyrim requires traveling to a number of places, including going to, or at least near, most of the hold capitals. There are two, however, that the main quest doesn't take you to or near at all, namely Falkreath and Dawnstar. Traveling and learning the land of Skyrim isn't as big a deal in the game Skyrim as it is in Morrowind, but it still is granted some importance in the main quest line. There's a point in the main quest where you're told of a place called Skoldafen, and that you A. need to get there to defeat Alduin the World Eater, and B. can't get there without being able to fly. This presents an interesting problem for you to solve. Or rather, it would if the person from which you received this information weren't also the same person that could get you there by flying. This person being a dragon you've captured, by the way. Solving this problem could have been an interesting way to incorporate the need for travel and the existence of natural barriers to travel into the main quest. If only you got the information about Skoldafen from some other source, and that had prompted you to capture that dragon instead. Given that levitation is illegal and the Dragonborn would never commit a crime against Imperial law, that would necessitate the capture of a dragon to fly you to the place. But that's enough about Skyrim for now, so let's move on to Arena and Daggerfall. They're lumped together because they're fairly similar. Arena is unique in the franchise to allow you to travel to each of the provinces of the Empire, rather than limiting the player to a certain geographical area. Likewise, Daggerfall involves the player going to each of the three kingdoms of the Iliac Bay region, and various environs between. As such, travel is very important narratively. At least, the player traveling is very important. There isn't nearly a sense of transportation in Arena and Daggerfall as there are in the future games. This makes sense. Firstly, these games are much older, and the world is not represented with the same degree of fidelity as it is in the later games. Secondly, in Arena and Daggerfall, fast travel is the only reasonable method of travel over great distances, so the details are glossed over. It can be assumed that the character is traveling by foot or horse if going over land, and hiring a boat if traveling by sea. None of it is really seen, however. While it certainly is the case that the player's imagination is of paramount importance in any role playing game, being able to see something in order to lax the requirements upon that imagination is always nice. These games don't feel nearly as strongly that NPCs are traveling, that there are really people who move around the place. Sure, you can get letters in Daggerfall, but some of them are literally transported by magic, and even the ones that are delivered by real people feel very strange. The Iliac Bay is huge, and you can go anywhere therein, so couriers finding you with apparent ease feels very odd. That being said, any sort of open world RPG is always going to have struggles with delivering messages to the player unless their position could reasonably be tracked by NPCs, such as NPCs knowing that the player has a certain location that they frequent. One thing I should mention is that Arena does this slightly better than Daggerfall, which makes sense as travel is more important in the narrative of the story. Whenever you travel to a city in Arena, you do get a small animation of a guy riding on a horse through a field. That's pretty neat. It also has, in my opinion, a slightly better way of telling you how long it will take to get to your destination than Daggerfall does. I'm glossing over the details of these two games, but there's not much more to say. Time is a concern, and there's going to be more to this video than just an analysis of the Elder Scrolls. However, before we can continue past that, there's one last game to cover. Oblivion. Oblivion. In the Elder Scrolls 4, there is no public transit, unlike its predecessor Morrowind and its successor Skyrim. I think that this is an interesting choice. Remember when I mentioned the town of Caldera in Morrowind and how it didn't have a Siltstrider platform? I find it very interesting that the same is true in the Imperial Province itself. Assuming that this is not some sort of oversight of game design, I wonder if this implies something about Imperial culture. We can assume that anyone of sufficient wealth and status could hire a private carriage, and conversely, anyone of insufficient wealth and status could not. Perhaps this is acceptable. Perhaps those of insufficient status shouldn't be allowed to travel. The serf should stay on their turf. I don't think there's anything that even hints to this in the lore, but I can't help but admire the coincidence if it wasn't intentional. I mean, this is an empire we're talking about. Restricting the freedoms of its citizens is part and parcel to its very being, and why not restrict freedom of movement? But as for what travel does exist, there is some. Merchants do travel from place to place, though I must note that these are people of wealth and status. Imperial soldiers patrol the roads, and bandits lie in wait just off those roads. The Black Horse Courier is a business in the Imperial City, but it doesn't actually function as a courier service, apparently. It's a newspaper. The existence of a newspaper is incredibly important to keep in mind, however, especially one that seemingly has a presence throughout the entire province. Travel is a lot less important in the narrative of Oblivion, which I find fairly strange. The main quest doesn't force you to travel to that many places, although the optional Allies for Bruma quest does ask that you go to each of the major cities in Cyrodiil. In Arena and Morrowind, the journey is the center of the story. In Daggerfall and Skyrim, the journey is secondary to the goals of the character, but is still of importance. In Oblivion, though, the travel is largely ancillary to the storyline. This isn't necessarily a flaw of the story, though it does make Oblivion stand out amongst its peers in my estimation. As I said earlier, The Lord of the Rings is one of the foundational texts in modern fantasy storytelling, and in that series, the travel is paramount. The whole goal of the Fellowship is to get to Orad Ruin and cast the ring into its fires. This change of form for Oblivion is a pretty significant break from that tradition. But I think that is enough about the Elder Scrolls for now. Let's go on to talking about world building in general. Don't worry though, we'll come back to the Elder Scrolls a little bit later. When we're discussing travel, we need to start with a few questions. Why do people feel the need to travel? What is required for people to engage in travel? What means are available for people to do so? So, why do people travel? Well, it depends on a lot of factors. One reason, however, is independent wanderlust. Some people just have that urge to go out into the world and see new things, to leave the nest, to go where your lineage has never gone before. This curiosity is built into humans, and almost certainly would be for any other intelligent species. But there are a number of other reasons to travel. One is need. If a disaster occurs and uproots a population, they will have no choice other than to die or to leave. We can look at human history and see a lot of times in which people have been forced out of an environment for any number of reasons and have been forced to move. Natural disasters, crop blights, changes in climate, all of these can cause a massive number of people to migrate. Of course, there are also human-caused instances of forced migration, such as the pogroms and the Pale of Settlement, Missouri Executive Order 44, the consequences of brutal warfare, and of course the removal of various native peoples in the Americas, Africa, and other colonized lands. It isn't all horror, though. There are many other reasons that people travel, of course, such as for trade. Different places have different material conditions, and the people in those places will gain access to those materials. However, for people to gain access to those materials foreign to them, they need people to bring them, or they need to go fetch those materials themselves. Trade becomes a backbone of society once it is established, and the collapse of trade often leads to the collapse of society as it existed prior. An example of that was the Silk Road. In the wake of the Black Death and the collapse of Genghis Khan's empire, the Silk Road was crippled, cutting off most trade between Europe and China, and thus everything in between. This did cause an economic downturn in Europe, which necessitated the explorations of the Portuguese trying to find new routes to China and India by sea. And with trade comes so much the spread of religion, art, language, culture, technological advancements. The impact of these exchanges is probably immeasurable. One of the temptations during world building is to design a culture in a vacuum, as though it were not affected by outside cultures. But that's not how any culture, even the most hegemonic, works. This is a temptation for a couple of reasons. One, it just makes doing it easier. Considering the ramifications of cultural exchange makes the creation of a culture significantly harder. It is easy to get overwhelmed by the possibilities, so one might want to take the easier way out and just consider the culture in a vacuum. Secondly, if you have a solid idea of what a culture looks like in your mind and you want to flesh it out, you kind of start with that kernel and work outwards. In essence, you create a way of thinking where you're basing the whole culture on the initial seed. This is a bias that a world builder should be aware of and consider whilst building any culture for a world. Another reason for travel is pilgrimage. Every year in our real world, so many people make a journey for a religious reason. Whether it is to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Masjid al Haram in Mecca, the Mayadevi Temple in Lumbini, the Shrine of Baha'u'llah in Akhr, or the Swaminari in Akshardham in Robbinsville, New Jersey. There are also plenty of people that take non religious cultural pilgrimages. People travel to the birthplaces of Elvis Presley and Karl Marx, to the field of Gettysburg, and the concentration camp at Auschwitz. The reasons for these pilgrimages are many. Human beings, for better or worse, ascribe a lot of value to places. The places at which important events happen gain a cultural mark, a scar, invisible but very much felt. Whether they elicit reverence or horror, people feel those marks, and often travel to do so. One interesting thing about pilgrimage as travel is that it sort of requires travel to have happened in the past. After all, if a holy site of your religion is far away from you, that means that people of your religion have traveled far, either to get to that holy site or to get to you. Another reason for travel is the simple fact that not all people settle down in one spot. Plenty of cultures throughout history and up to the modern day are nomadic. There are benefits to a nomadic lifestyle. Natural resources that are used while in one portion of the land will replenish while that land is vacant. Having a rich culture of nomadic people groups in a world can really bring some realism to that world, and that movement makes the world feel vibrant and alive. I would highly recommend considering sprinkling them into a world, if you haven't done so already, in your world building projects. And there are certainly more reasons to travel, but let's continue on to a different question. What methods of travel are available? In a fantasy world, all sorts of methods of travel are available. Firstly, we have all of the mundane options walking, sailing, riding, etc., but a fantasy setting can have so many more options. There are fantasy modifications that can be made to all of those mundane methods of travel. Of course, people could ride fantasy creatures or sail boats made out of fantasy materials. If we are to include magic in our fantasy setting, we can include magical variants of these methods of travel. Magical carriages, which require no beasts to draw them, magical equipment to make walking easier and faster, boats, which require no wind to fill their sails, etc. Magic in a fantasy setting can also grant new methods of travel. Flight and teleportation are the obvious methods, but both of these can have details causing them to manifest in a number of different ways. For flight, perhaps there are magical skyships, spells to make individuals fly, or magical flying creatures upon which people may ride. For teleportation, there may be permanent or semi permanent portals or teleportation circles which are linked together, spells that teleport an individual to any place they've been before, or spells that teleport to specific predetermined locations, such as temples or important cultural landmarks. The implications of high speed travel on a world are severe. High speed transmission of material goods, but more importantly, information, can really make a big difference. In history, in a time of war, for example, there would often be weeks of preparation before armies were rallied and ready to face the enemy. In a world with, say, teleportation, that time for word to reach the capital and then to the ruler's vassals and allies might be orders of magnitude shorter. This is not including the effects that teleportation would have after those armies are mustered. The methods of travel that you choose are important. Some are more flashy than others, such as the Silt Striders of Morrowind, but there's nothing wrong with selecting mundane options. You shouldn't feel the need to make your world more strange unless you do so holistically. If your setting is fairly run of the mill medieval European, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way, don't include fantastical mounts. That will cause a tonal whiplash. The reason that the Silt Striders of Morrowind work well is because the overarching feeling of foreignness that Morrowind conveys. In fact, it would be strange to see horse-drawn carriages on Vardenfell and take the player out of that world. While the traveling of people is incredibly important in the world, so too is the travel of information. As I mentioned briefly a moment ago, in real history, until relatively recently, the transmission of information has only really been as fast as a guy on a horse, if that quickly. This has caused a lot of problems, especially in times of armed conflict where a delay will cost human lives. There have been attempts at very fast transmissions of information in the past by using semaphores, but the type of information that can be transmitted is very limited. A semaphore is any apparatus for visual signaling. This can be anything from smoke signals to lighthouses to traffic lights. There are a number of historical examples of nations constructing a series of beacons to be lit in the event of an invasion. For example, there was a series of fires along the Great Wall of China to warn against invasion from the north, a series of beacons in the Eastern Roman Empire to warn against invasion from the east, and a series of beacons in Elizabethan England to warn against the Spanish Armada. There are a few problems with these kinds of beacons. Firstly, the type of communication that they can provide, while incredibly useful, is incredibly limited. They can only be used to communicate one thing. Secondly, they're prone to false alarms. If one of the beacons just happens to catch fire accidentally, the people in the next beacon will see the fire and certainly assume that they should light their own beacon. Thirdly, is a simple economic requirement. These beacons need to be constantly maintained and staffed, and that staff needs to work throughout all hours of day and night. Other forms of semaphores have other restrictions, however, the primary one is, of course, visibility. While all of them allow for some amount of communication across distances, they all require being able to see that message clearly. Something like smoke signals requires it to be daytime, sure, but also not foggy. A fire signal requires a clear line of sight, and again, there to be no fog, but also for it to be dark enough for people to see the fire. And all of them require appropriate terrain. A hill in the way is not conducive to sending a visual signal, after all. These forms of communication are incredibly valuable and have been throughout history, and so a world builder should heavily consider introducing them into their world. However, they should take care and seriously consider the limitations of semaphores and communication thereby, and implement them appropriately. Even if those limitations are never hammered out in detail, an offhand mention of sailors needing to take a certain amount of time during their training to learn a flag language can go a ways to adding the air of realism to a story. It is also the case that, in addition to information, the transmission of goods is also very important. This will usually be done in the same manner as how people are transported, but there might be differences. This is particularly the case if there might be a very fast form of magical travel that might be too dangerous for people to be subjected to. And this is not just the transfer of trade goods, but also materiel. While war is a small part of the human experience, it is an incredibly important, frankly, grave part. Especially if one side has a greater ability to transfer materiel quickly, the impact of high speed transportation could seriously impact the way that a war plays out. But I think that's enough about talking in the abstract. I hope y'all get the picture by now. So let's move on to some concrete examples, and to do so, I'll bring back the Elder Scrolls as a topic of conversation. I'm going to make some small alterations to the Elder Scrolls world as presented in the games to show what could have been. To start our mental exercise, we're going back to Vardenfell. As I said in the first section of this video, Morrowind is the game that I think does travel the best in the franchise, so my alterations here will be small. In fact, my alterations are limited to one addition, the introduction of a new minor faction. The Ramer Tong, Dunmaris for the Staff Men Guild, is an association of couriers. The name comes from the walking sticks these travelers often use. The Ramer Tong has a long history of providing their services and operates under a strict professional code of conduct. Their couriers are sworn to do their deliveries and to ensure that the confidentiality of their letters is upheld. The Ramer Tong has a presence all over Morrowind, though it is strongest in Dress, Enderil, and Redoran lands. The Telvanni, with their mastery of the arcane arts, have other ways of communicating, and the Hlalu are too easily bribed to have lapses in their professional conduct. Due to this long history and strong presence in House Dress lands, the Ramertong also has some access to their paraptons, which they use for high-speed delivery, for an extra charge, of course. Paraptons, for those unfamiliar, are canonical, flying wasp-like insects primarily used by House Dress slavers as mounts. They tragically did not make it into Morrowind. They only appear in the official Origins of Cyrus comic and receive their name from unofficial material. Throughout the history of Morrowind, the Ramer Tong has secured the people's ability to communicate. A courier is always available at any Ramer Tong guildhouse, and rates are fixed due to the guild's stranglehold over the business. While plenty have complained about those rates being too high, they don't change, so people know what payment will be required before they even walk through the doors of the guildhouse. The introduction of the Ramer Tong as a courier's guild is the one addition that I would make to Morrowind, and I think that the lore I have provided fits into the world sufficiently. But that's the game that I think does it the best, so let's move on to a game that I think does it worse, so let's talk about Oblivion some more. I would like to be an Elder Scrolls old head and make the assumption that Cyrodiil is an endless jungle, as depicted in the Pocket Guide to the Empire First Edition. If that were the case, then the most reasonable form of transportation would be via the many rivers that run throughout the land. However, that is not how it was depicted in the game we got. Tiber Septim realized that no one actually liked the jungle, and with his divine powers breathed his breath of long winter to terraform the entire province. So I must resign myself to Cyrodiil as we have seen it. The first adjustment that I would make would be the Black Horse Courier being an actual courier service. The Empire as we know it would almost certainly not allow an independent newspaper, but I'm not really sure how independent the Black Horse is. Either way, a courier service should exist. Instead, I propose the state-owned Heartland Star newspaper. The Pocket Guide to the Empire was commissioned by Tiber Septim himself as a propaganda brochure, so I have full faith in the Empire to uphold that honorable tradition of delivering convenient truths and falsehoods to its people. The Heartland Star, of course, has correspondence all throughout the Empire, though the printing of the actual newspaper is mostly limited to Cyrodiil itself. The Imperial censors, of course, have ultimate authority over what does and does not get printed, though there have been some oversights in the past, leading to some inconvenient truths being allowed to see print. The Empire is an empire. Redundant, I know. Empires have always found it very useful to control the information that is distributed to their people. I think the introduction of a state owned newspaper, one that is explicitly so, would improve the world that we have seen in Oblivion. In Oblivion, as we discussed, there's not any sort of public transit. I am personally going to accept this as an intended insight into Cyrodiilic culture, so I'm not going to add any. However, that doesn't mean I'm done with Cyrodiil. We see in the Wizard's Tower DLC that Frostcrag Spire has a group of teleporters, one to each of the mages' guilds in Cyrodiil. The important thing to note about these teleporters is that they are one way. Keep this in mind for a moment. Throughout my version of Cyrodiil, there are multiple series of beacons. Along each of the provincial borders, a series of beacons are constructed, and each one has a tail that leads to a ring of these beacons circling around Lake Rumaire. If any of the provinces decided to push any sort of border claim with Cyrodiil, one of the beacons along that border would be lit, and that message would then be transmitted directly to the Imperial City by that series of beacons. Just outside of the Arcane University, there is a field with 8 magical henges, each of which are maintained by the staff of the university. When activated, these henges act as magical portals to some fort near one of the borders of Cyrodiil. The Imperial City uses these to redeploy their legions in the event that one of those beacons are lit. Because they are one-way teleporters, the Imperial City itself is not threatened by their existence. These henges are not very large, about 4 people could walk abreast through them, or a single horse-drawn supply cart. The Empire, due to its plethora of resources, can afford to maintain these beacons, though some of the more decadent emperors have certainly found that their meager pocketbooks simply couldn't handle that burden. It has also been the case that on a number of occasions throughout the Empire's tenure, there have been border skirmishes amongst the provinces. These teleporters have allowed Imperial legions to redeploy just that bit quicker to ensure that a peace is quickly enforced. I think that I'm done with Oblivion for now, but there's certainly more that could be said. I'm going to briefly go over the other 3 games, however these changes are less directly related to the world building of the games than the changes for Morrowind and Oblivion. For Skyrim, I would just make that change that I mentioned for the narrative. Instead of having a captured dragon tell us of Skuldafn, and that we could only get there by flight, I would have Esbern dredge up some ancient text that mentioned it. Instead of capturing the dragon to get that information, we would need to capture them to provide us a mode of transportation. I think that this would cement the role of travel in the narrative of the game. For Arena and Daggerfall, I understand the limitations of the games, so I would just add a few sprites that can show up in towns. There would be a couple of variants of horses hitched up to carts, perhaps one with a noble sitting in the cart waiting until it is time to depart. I think that this kind of imagery would just make the mind wonder, I wonder where she's off to. And that would make the world feel more alive. Throughout history, people have been moving. Not just ourselves, but we have also moved goods and ideas all across the planet. Even before our modern history, pieces of art have shown up thousands of miles away from where they were created. Travel is a fundamental aspect of the human experience and of the history of our world. The same must be said for any fantasy world. In storytelling, travel very often plays a part, especially in grand fantasy epics. The role that travel has to play in the narrative shouldn't be understated, and the experience of going on a grand journey is very enticing to a lot of people. The Elder Scrolls series, on the whole, does a very good job of bringing these things to the forefront, though it isn't perfect. No creative enterprise ever will be. If I may go on a slight tangent, I'd like to put forward something a bit important. While I have added some things to the lore here and claimed that they are improvements to the setting, I'm not saying that I could have made the setting better. When you are creating a world, you can do so in parts, as I did. I looked at the entire world, but only focused on one small, though important, aspect. The reader of a text or the players of a game are not going to focus on those small aspects. They will see the world holistically. I put no effort in this exercise into improving any other aspect of the world, just the one. While it may be easy to improve specific aspects of a setting, the world must be created in its totality. So I never want my quote unquote improvements to be taken as implying a failure on the part of those that worked on a setting. They didn't fail to make the world better, they simply had to work on a lot more than I did. But with all that said, if you made it this far, thank you so much. My mediocre skill with words cannot state how much I appreciate your support. Please do all the YouTube things if you feel that I deserve the like or subscription. If you would like to leave a comment but don't know what to say, tell me about what game or book has felt like the grandest journey to you, or what is your favorite aspect of travel in any video game. Mine is actually the elevator scenes in the first Mass Effect. I'm devastated that they were rid of in its sequels.